So after spending the last couple of months doing other things, I was back up the old estate lake, and really this was just a trip to refamiliarise myself with the water. So I started with a bait that I know works, which is sweet corn, in a swim that I know quite well. And it's difficult to tell from this, but there's a weed bed that runs along the bank to the right of the swim, and I was baiting and fishing just on the point of that. And even though the water is still down after the long hot summer we've had and carrying far more colour than usual, it didn't take too long for the bait to be picked up by a tench. And after a brief but tense tussle, I managed to get myself off the mark. I was a little surprised at how pale the tench are at the moment, and they've obviously had it quite tough because they're looking a little lean. But they seem to have plenty of life in them with the way that they were fighting. And as I say, I was just baiting on the end of the weed bed and just looking to intercept fish as they came along the front of that, because they definitely use it as a patrol route. And where there's one, there's often more. And so that proved to be the case. And before too long, another one came along. Now this can be a problem when you're margin fishing. If the fish doesn't want to get off the spot and continually swims around where you're trying to fish, it kicks up a lot of silt and spooks everything. Sometimes I think it works for you actually. Kicking up a bit of silt and putting even more colour in the water can actually help attract more fish in, but initially it will spook everything off the spot, and this one really didn't want to leave the spot. It was determined to keep plugging around. And again, this was a very sort of pale and lean looking fish. So I rested the swim for a few minutes and then tried again. And this time, surprisingly, I started to catch these little immature carp, and I've never ever caught immature carp from here before. Although you see the fish spawning, the success rate doesn't seem to be great. But this year, obviously different, because I seem to be catching them one a chuck. And this one in particular, a stunning little linear, is very much going to be a target fish in years to come. And it's great to see that the water is kind of replenishing its stocks for future generations. And then I also caught this little thing, the smallest of the lot, but it really brought a smile to my face because I did a quick scale count and a fin check, and to all the world it looked like an immature Crucian. And that's really great to see because they are few and far between in this lake. And even if just a couple get through every year, that's something. But you know they're small when they don't make a splash when you put them back. And as the buzzard continued to call overhead, I put the float out once again. And I'm barely fishing a rod length out, maybe a little more, rod length and a half, but not very far at all. And I've got the float set so the tip's just in the surface film, and the second it breaks the surface is when I strike, because I'm using it on a lift method, as you might have seen me describe in another video. And this fish was a bit more energetic, and it turned out to be an immature tench, but you can see how shallow it is. Normally that would be sort of 2.5, 3 foot deep out there. And this isn't this year's fish, this is probably a couple of summers old. And I'm starting to get a bit complacent, so when the next fish took and started tearing off, it took me by surprise. And I thought maybe a rogue carp had snuck along the front of the weed bed, and I hadn't seen it coming, and it had managed to get to the hook bait. Because further down the bank I was actually feeding some carp right in the edge, in barely inches of water. And I wasn't feeding them to fish for, I was feeding them just to see what's about and to keep them out of the way, really. Because although I have landed plenty of carp on this setup, I don't normally set out to target them directly in weedy waters with this. It's a little bit too light, this setup. So I prefer to go with something a little stronger, and because there is a lot of weed in here at the minute. So I'd been feeding the carp further down as part of my kind of reconnaissance trip and just seeing what's about. And there is a very, very special mirror carp that I've got my eye on in here. It's not particularly big, but a very dark, fully scaled mirror that I dearly love to catch. And that's probably the only carp I'm going to fish for from here on in, which is why I've come back to the lake. But this tench was giving me the proper run around. And it is nice when they stretch their legs. I've said before that the tench in this water, pound for pound, fight far harder than anything else in here. And if they grew anywhere near the size of the carp, you'd never land them. And this was a much older fish, a much darker fish, with a real kind of bullish head to it. And you've got to imagine that in the spring she'd be carrying a fair bit of weight. Certainly got the frame for it. A lovely, lovely looking fish. So with renewed enthusiasm, I thought I'd take one last cast just to the corner of the weed bed. As I say, there's a lot of Canadian in here at the minute. It's all sitting just below the water. And once again the bait was taken by another turbocharged tench. But this one actually kited left into a weed bed that I didn't know was there. And what you quite often find is when a fish hits the weed bed and covers its eyes, it sort of stops fighting. And it becomes a bit of a tug of war, and you just tow the whole lot in. That's exactly what happened here. You can see the weed and the tail sticking out the back. You can even see the silk coming up where the weed has pinged off the bottom. And this was a slightly different fish again. Beautiful olive green with a kind of goldish hue to it. A stunning fish. And a great way to reintroduce myself to the old estate lake.